Right, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 17 of Radio Europa. I'm your host, Will, tonight from England, and joined with me is Laura, also from England, and Darth from Scotland. And if you listen to this on a regular basis, you'll be familiar with the three of us by now. Today, we're going to talk about the recent news that the Russian intelligence service has been accused of carrying out some hacks on the World Anti-Doping Organization and some other targets. And this has been raised specifically by the governments of the UK, the Netherlands, and the United States, and also Canada have had some involvement. So we're going to be talking about that and maybe get on to some elections in the Baltic region, which are connected to Russia as well. After that, so Darth, if I can just bring you in on this one, what do you think? I mean, do you think this is a legitimate operation by the Russians, or do you think this is a false flag that is being exaggerated by our security services?
Honestly, since the Cold War was or quotation marks Cold War was taking place, there was constant propaganda from both the US and its allies and the USSR. As far as I'm concerned, this kind of thing goes on with the US government, the British government. I mean, look what happened with Edward Snowden. Look what he released about what the NSA was up to, literally hoovering up information that they had no need to have, and that was their cover story was, oh, we're doing this in the name of global safety. So I wouldn't be surprised if this kind of stuff has been ongoing, but in my honest opinion, I think this is just standard what governments do these days, and everybody's getting their knickers in a twist because it's Russia.
Yeah, I'm kind of inclined to agree with you on that, because I think, as you said, this is the sort of thing that goes on amongst governments of the major powers all the time, and we only hear about probably 1% of the shady activities that both sides get up to. So, sort of on that line of thought, Laura, do you think that this is something maybe that isn't really a massive story? It's just something that is a fact of geopolitics, and that really it's not newsworthy.
Yeah, well, actually, Darth sent me over a video before we started filming this from RT, and they were saying that whenever it's Russia, it kind of gets a huge focus, but then whenever it's any other country that's involved with hacking, because let's be honest, there are hackers from all countries, nobody seems to focus on it. But to be honest, it's one of those topics that I kind of zone out on, because it's for everything that happens that goes against the mainstream narrative. Russia gets blamed for it, don't they? So there was Trump, and then there was the involvement in Syria, and there was Brexit. And it does remind me of the Syria chemical attacks, actually, because people are always saying that they have firm evidence of things that have happened, but then we never get to see this evidence. And with the Syria chemical attacks, Putin was saying that he had evidence that Assad hadn't done it, but then Macron in France was saying that he had evidence that Assad had done it. And it's like, well, one of you is lying. And I love Britain so much. I honestly do. I'm such a proud Brit, and I love my country very much. But I don't believe anything that the state or the media say. So when they say that they have firm evidence for something, I just don't believe it, really. And I think it's just kind of, I think people like to latch onto it because it's like they're able to say, well, that result in that election wasn't genuine because Russia did it, and it just seems to be whenever it goes against something that the establishment want, they do just blame Russia. So yeah, I would say that it's not really as huge a story as they're making out to be. And like I said, that video that Dath sent me, that lady on RT who was on the news, she was just saying that all countries hack, and they do. And we hear about hacking attacks in Britain on other British people, and they're never really blown up into proportion. It only seems like when it's Russia, it's a huge focus.
Yeah,
yeah. Sorry, Darth, come.
No, I was just very quickly gonna mention what Laura was saying about governments spy on their own people and hack their own people's stuff all the time. I mean, is there not the Conservative government not right now putting through this legislation? It's basically allowing them to spy on their own people in Britain in the name of preventing terrorist attacks.
Well, yeah, exactly. This is actually something that crossed my mind, was that the fact that our governments tend to make such a big fuss about any of these allegations involving Russia. And you might have an opinion on this. Do you think that part of the big fuss made of it is to legitimize the security measures, quote unquote, that our governments are taking in terms of restricting anonymity and freedom of expression on the internet?
I think as long as the powers that be are able to peddle an enemy, quote unquote, whoever that enemy may be, as long as there is an identifiable enemy for the government to point at and say, these are the people who are threatening your well-being, your existence, your safety, they can then implement laws, legislation in the name of protecting you against these boogeymen. But ultimately, it's a cover story to allow them to gain more control over you. I mean, it was Al-Qaeda at first, then it's ISIS, now it's Russia. You know, it's an ever-evolving group of people. Simply, in my opinion, the more and more I've studied politics and studied kind of modern events, is it's an excuse simply for them to be able to control. I mean, I know it's dramatised, but I watched that film on Edward Snowden recently online, and you know what it showed. You know that you've got people in bunkers all over the world are hoovering up huge amounts of data, you know, and are able to spy on anybody they want, you know, hack into any phone, hack into any laptop. How realistic it is, I don't know, but, you know, they are unethically collecting data for their own purposes. They're not being held to account for what they're doing. It's simply just, you know, we are trying to prevent terrorism, but while we're here, we might as well just hoover up everything else just in case we find something that we can criminalise somebody on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is a big danger as long as these accusations are flying around the geopolitics where they're saying, oh, the Russians did this and the Islamists did this and so on and so forth. We're going to get that. And any of our listeners that are familiar with Marxism will know the dialectical process. And that's exactly what's in play here, is that you've got the government wants to, the British and the German and the French governments, for instance, want to implement security measures, but they need an enemy to legitimize it. So whether Russia is the enemy in their eyes or not, whether they believe it or not, is immaterial because they need it to legitimize their actions. And Laura, just to pick up on something you said before, you mentioned being patriotic and but not believing the state line on these things. Do you think, and this is a bit of a delicate subject for a lot of people, but do you think that supporting, taking the Kremlin line, as it were, over the Whitehall or the Berlin line or whatever is unpatriotic, or do you think it's a sign of simply being aware of the deceit that has poisoned our political discourse?
Well, I think if you were to just say that you firmly supported Britain in every decision that they made, then you'd be kind of stupid, really. And I think you need to be able to judge things critically and say that was a good decision or that was a bad decision. But when I say I love Britain, I mean I love like our land and our people. I don't mean I love the state. I don't love Theresa May and I don't love the Conservative Party. And I just think that they talk absolute bollocks, and I think the media do as well. And I just don't believe anything that they say. And when these stories are coming out, because it's the BBC that have been talking about it as well, who are obviously our biggest media outlet, state funded, so our taxpayers for it. I just don't believe anything they say, because it's like the boy who cried wolf, isn't it? They've just lied so many times. I just don't think the public support them anymore. But like with going back to Syria again, but with when we said that we supported the USA bombing Syria, I was completely against that. And I think it's okay to say that you disagree with things that your country has done. It doesn't mean that you don't love your nation or don't love your people. You can just say that the people that are in power at the minute are useless, and they're just, I mean, we've got traitors in power at the minute in Britain. I definitely don't support them, but it doesn't mean that, I'm not fond of England. What do you think? Do you agree, or are you the other way?
Well, that's the sort of the point I was getting at, and I wanted to try and clear that up with the listeners and just make it clear that, just taking a neutral observation or even going so far as to support the Kremlin line on these matters it's not unpatriotic. It's what you choose to believe based on the evidence in front of you. And like you made the good point that state and nation are two different entities, and you can be totally against the state in every aspect of its dealings, but still be a nationalist, still be a patriot, and still love your country. And that's the point. And I don't think anybody's suggesting that, if Russian tanks were literally on the lawn, as it were, that we would, welcome them with a cup of tea. Of course not. But the point is, in this sort of information war, it's vital to, if you think that your own state is acting immorally and against the interests of its people, then it's vital to call it out. And if that means siding with the narrative that comes from a foreign government that's considered a hostile party, if you like, I think that's perfectly okay. Darth, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, just right at the end there. I mean, if I'm really, really going to simplify my views here, if you take the anecdote of two people start fighting, one person pushes one person, that person gets pushed back, and before you know it, there's a fight. The person who receives the first push, they claim victimhood because they didn't instigate the fight. But ultimately, in the eyes of the law, both people are as bad as each other. And this is how I kind of see this, is we know that all countries are doing these kind of skullduggery tactics ultimately to gain advantage over another country. And I think it's very much that the West is crying victim of Russian meddling, but do not obviously say anything when they are hacking into Russia, when they are on the offensive, because it doesn't fit their narrative. But it's at that point now where, the West can't really claim to be the innocent party here, because we know fine well that they've been doing it for so long. Okay, maybe a legitimate reason back during the Soviet Union when they were afraid of World War III and nuclear missiles going across the sky. But as far as I'm saying, all governments are as bad as each other at this point. And you can't really say, well, one's better than the other, because they're all doing the same thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that, of course, if we're accusing them of doing it, you can be under no illusions that we're also doing it, because we'd be foolish as a state. I'm talking, when I say we'd be foolish not to try and level the playing field by adopting the same intelligence gathering tactics. But it is developing, interestingly, geopolitics at the moment, and of course Europe's at the heart of this, because there's a lot of shall we say border skirmishes. I don't mean literally, but we know that the European Union seeks to expand eastwards, and it already has to the Baltics, but Moscow considers its sphere of influence to include some of the territories that the European Union also considers its sphere of influence. So in that respect, in the wider scheme of things, it's shaping up quite nicely. And I think that brings us nicely on to the point that I briefly mentioned at the beginning about the elections in Latvia. So for those that don't know, there's an election in Latvia, and news came out today that the centre-left, ostensibly, party came first with just over 20% of the vote. Social Democratic Harmony Party, I believe they're called, and one of their stated ideological platforms is what people term Russian minority politics, because the 25% of Latvia's population are Russian, and this party obviously speaks for their interests. The point that makes this interesting is that Latvia is, of course, a member of the European Union, but no government will be able to form a coalition feasibly without including this pro-Russia party. A couple of other populist parties, one pro-EU and one anti-EU, also did well in the elections. So the likelihood is that these groups will sort of form an uneasy alliance. Laura, I'll just come to you on a sort of broad point on this. So obviously the Baltics, the same issue is at play in Estonia, where 25% of their population is also Russian. And people, I know NATO and the EU held some very public sort of shows of political strength over in that region. Do you think that any of the Baltic countries, like Latvia or Estonia, could become another Ukraine, whereby pro-Russian groups seek separation, and then they're backed by the Russian military, and we see some hotting up of this new Cold War?
Well, to be honest, I'm not really sure if I agree with pro-Russian parties kind of leading in other countries, because I've got nothing against Russia. In fact, I like them and I like Putin, but if it was like a pro-Muslim party or a pro-Jew party, I'd be against it. So I don't think that that parties which are pro anything other than the native population should be leading and should be able to dominate, really. I'm not too familiar with like the whole Ukraine Cold War situation, so it's not very a good question for me, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that if that's all right.
Yeah, I will share that in a moment, but Darth, same point to you as well, just sort of to get a broad scope of opinion here. What do you think of that as the Baltics could become another theatre of this proxy war going on?
Well, I think, we saw when Russia, I guess, annexed Crimea, and they claimed that their reason for it was that the majority of the population wanted to be part of Russia again. And you saw the way that the West and the USA and the rest of the world reacted in a very, very angry manner. And obviously, sanctions were put on Russia and various people's assets were frozen in the markets. And if something like that was to happen again, if the population of Latvia, for example, decided to vote to move closer to Russia, I have a funny feeling that the West would attempt to step in and prevent that from happening, regardless of whether it was a democratic, vote. Say a referendum, for example, so something like Brexit, but they inevitably voted to move closer to Russia politically, or even to join Russia. I could see that sparking, conflict to the extent where the West tries to get involved to prevent Russia from gaining any more power than it already has, for absolute terror of going back to the days of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if the Russians would chance their arm on that, because, like you said, there was quite a strong response from the West when the Crimea was annexed and when the two small regions of the Ukraine seceded from European sovereignty, if you like. I think I'm sort of inclined to. I'm torn on this issue, if I'm totally honest, because I'm inclined to agree with you, Laura, that a minority voice shouldn't be dictating the direction of politics in a country that isn't their own. Of course, that's logical and perfectly reasonable, and I do agree with that. On the other hand, I wouldn't really want pro-EU parties getting too much control in these countries either, especially in the East, because at the moment the East is sort of the vanguard against the expansion of Brussels. But it's kind of, unfortunately, this seems to be reduced to something of a binary choice, because if these smaller nations in the East don't fall under the sphere of influence of one, they will by default fall into the sphere of influence of the other. So I don't know whether it's a pick your poison or try and find a middle ground. But I really am torn on that issue. But just so if I can just broaden the conversation a little bit away from Latvia and generally speaking, in this, what I've been calling to myself the neo-Cold War, the new Cold War. I'm going to just ask you your final thoughts on this, because it will be interesting in the future to see what happens, whether what the Americans do and what Brussels wants to do in terms of a European army, maybe to combat this real or perceived threat from the East. Laura, where do you think we're going in that respect? It's quite a broad question, but just roughly speaking, where do you think we're heading with the whole Russia relations stuff?
Oh gosh. Well, I think I mean that with all these investigations that are going on and all these accusations flying backwards and forwards, I think it's pretty obvious that our state and also other European states and the EU and the United States are very kind of against Russia. They've been accused of all sorts of things. I mentioned Brexit, Syria, the Trump election, and then I mean there was the Russian murder that was that last year or something, or at the start of this year there was that, and then there's all these new hacking accusations that are flying backwards and forwards. So I think it's pretty obvious that our state is against it and the establishment is against it. So I don't see relationships blossoming anytime soon. I'm not actually sure how Trump feels about Putin, because isn't he quite favourable about him on Twitter, or doesn't he say that he wants to have a good relationship with him? But
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of seems like the establishment have already made up their mind that Trump are the enemy. So yeah, I don't see us having a good relationship with them going forward at all. And the annoying thing is we don't get anything out of Russia being our enemy. Like, they're such a powerful country. Why wouldn't we want to be friends with them? And it was like when Marine Le Pen ran in the French presidential election and she received money from Russia for her campaign, and people were saying, well, why have you got it from Russia? And she was like, well, I don't see what the problem is with us not being okay with Russia. Like, it's better that they're our friend than they're our enemy. And she said that Russia were the only people that would back her election campaign, because she went to America and she came to us and loads of other places and no one else would. So I don't see why I don't see the benefit of us being enemies with Russia. I'd rather us be friends with them, but it definitely doesn't seem like that's where it's going. I think it will be bad in the future.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the only people that, like we said before, the only people that really gain anything from having this enemy, this big scary enemy, is the people who want to are the people who want to pass laws to restrict freedoms on the grounds of national security. You know, that old buzzword. Darth, just last point on this, and then we'll finish up. Same question to you. What direction do you think this is heading?
Just when Laura was making her point there, to me, it's kind of, we are slowly but surely heading towards a globalist world. One world government, and I think obviously the main leaders of that movement are desperately unhappy with Russia because it's basically doing what it wants. It's going in its own direction. It's not playing political ball with the other, oligarchs of the world. And I think this is their way of justifying movements. This country is not playing ball with our greater good policy, and therefore they must be tarnished as the enemy. And I think it can only inevitably lead to conflict in some way. I don't think Russia is anywhere near as powerful as what it used to be when it had obviously all the other Soviet states underneath its control. I think if it did come to all-out conflict, I don't think Russia would pose as much of a threat as it used to, but it's still a powerful country. But ultimately, I think that they are being used as the latest boogeyman because they are not playing the globalist game of, moving our borders so that we all can move freely and we can control all the populations of the world under one government. That's my thoughts, anyway.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of points there that I agree with, and I think broadly we're all in the consensus, under the same consensus, that this is only really going one way, because the people in charge of our countries are not going to do an about turn on this. And even in America, I think, whilst Trump presents something of a friendly front with Putin, as soon as he goes back to Washington, his handlers, if you like, behind him are putting sanctions on him, on Putin, putting sanctions on countries that deal with Russia, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think generally agree. This is the relations not going to get any better, and that just about concludes what we had planned for the agenda today. Just to remind you all, if you want to listen to previous episode 16, that's still up on Twitter and on SoundCloud and YouTube. Also, as we said in previous episodes, we're entirely crowdfunded, and all the money that's invested in us goes back into the project. We don't we don't derive any profit from it whatsoever. So if you would like to support us, help us keep doing what we're doing, links for donations will be in the description. And as ever, thanks for listening, and tune in next time.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Thank you.
Bye.